Okinawa, June 1945. Rain hammered the tin roofs of a makeshift POW camp, turning the earth into sticky brown glue. Beneath a sagging canvas tent, a young Japanese nurse crouched by a fire drum. She'd been captured only 3 days earlier, still in her torn uniform, still expecting punishment. Instead, an American sergeant handed her a dented canteen cup, steam curling from its rim. The smell hit first, sharp, burnt, alien. "Drink," the sergeant said, voice flat but not unkind. She hesitated. Inside the cup was a black liquid thicker than ink. To her, it looked like something scooped straight from the mud outside. But the men around her, these Americans, were drinking it like it was life itself. Some laughed, some sighed. She raised it to her lips. The first sip was a shock, bitter, smoky, wrong. She almost spat it out. A medic chuckled. "That's coffee," he said, offering sugar packets from his pocket. Sugar, the one thing she hadn't seen in months. Japanese soldiers hadn't tasted it since rationing stripped their rations to dust and rice gruel. Here, the enemy stirred sweetness into boiling water like it was nothing. Reports indicate that by 1945, the U.S. Army served nearly 250,000 gallons of coffee every single day across the Pacific. Coffee wasn't luxury, it was ritual. It fueled the night watches, the convoys, the invasion beaches. For these men, it was home in a cup. She watched them drink as rain hissed on hot metal. They didn't toast to victory or curse the defeated. They just drank, no ceremony, no words. The sound of spoons clinking against tin was strangely calm. "They drink bitterness and smile," she murmured in disbelief. It made no sense. How could the enemy be so relaxed, so human, so ordinary while standing inside a prison of their own making? Her hand trembled as she looked into the dark swirl again. The steam fogged her glasses, blurring faces into silhouettes. For the first time, the war felt distant, like something happening elsewhere. She sipped again, slower this time. It wasn't delicious, but it was warm, and that warmth carried something she hadn't felt in years: safety. As the steam rose, she leaned closer, inhaling that strange, bitter scent. She didn't know it yet, but the smell would follow her for decades, the smell of America itself. Next morning, she would notice that scent again, drifting from a GI canteen by the fire. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air still carried that same smoky, bitter fragrance. She woke to the sound of tin cups clinking again, the low hum of American voices mixing with the crackle of damp firewood. The nurse, now wearing an oversized army blanket as a shawl, watched the GI gather around a steel pot. One of them lifted the lid, and a thick wave of aroma hit her. Burnt beans, wet canvas, sugar melting into heat. It didn't smell like war. It smelled alive. She'd grown up with tea. Green, delicate, precise. Tea meant silence, respect, ceremony. But this was chaos brewed into a drink. The Americans scooped grounds with spoons, laughed when they spilled, stirred with bayonets, and somehow turned it into joy. One soldier teased another, "Don't boil it to death, Joe." The group erupted in laughter. Even prisoners smiled. According to records, the U.S. imported over 280 million pounds of coffee in 1944 alone, enough to drown entire cities in caffeine. Every GI carried packets of instant coffee in his ration kit, along with powdered cream and sugar. For them, coffee wasn't luxury, it was survival. It was warmth in the mud, focus in the gunfire, sanity in the noise. She leaned closer, trying to understand. Why this obsession? Why this drink? When the guard noticed her curiosity, he poured a small cup, motioned for her to take it. The gesture felt impossibly casual, almost friendly. "Try it again," he said. The nurse hesitated, then accepted. The steam fogged her face. She inhaled deeply this time. The smell, burnt, earthy, sweet, hit something deep inside her chest. "They fight with machines," she whispered, and comfort. That line came unbidden, the thought of a nation that could fight total war yet still find time to sweeten its bitterness. Coffee wasn't just a drink, It was proof that the enemy wasn't starving, wasn't breaking, they could afford warmth. Her hands shook not from fear but from realization. This wasn't victory, it was abundance. She took one cautious sip, then another. The taste still bit at her tongue, but the smell— God, that smell wouldn't leave. As she stared into the black liquid, a memory flickered. Kyoto, porcelain cups, green froth, her mother's gentle hands. And just like that, the war dissolved into memory. Steam curled in the air again, but this time her mind drifted thousands of miles away, to Kyoto. She remembered the tatami floor under her knees, the faint rattle of a bamboo whisk, and the rhythmic hush of her mother's breath. Tea in Japan wasn't just a drink. It was a ceremony, an act of devotion. You didn't gulp it, you respected it. Every motion mattered, the bow, the pour, the sip. Now, in this muddy camp, surrounded by barbed wire and diesel fumes, she watched Americans toss coffee grounds into boiling water as if brewing chaos itself. A GI wiped his hands on his pants and stirred with a knife handle. Another added sugar by the fistful. To her, it looked barbaric, and yet she couldn't look away. Back home, green tea had been rationed to near extinction. Reports show Japan's wartime production fell by over 70% by 1944. Soldiers on the front were lucky to taste a single cup all year. For many, it had become a memory of peace, something you dreamed about, not drank. She remembered the last tea she shared before being drafted into a field hospital unit. It was weak, thin, barely green. Her mother had smiled anyway, saying softly, "It's not the taste, it's the moment." That moment was gone now, swallowed by the roar of engines, the screams of men, and the bitterness of defeat. Watching the Americans laugh over their crude brew, she felt a strange pull. It wasn't envy, it was curiosity. How could something so rough, so graceless, bring them joy? Maybe they didn't need ceremony. Maybe they had found warmth in imperfection. Her thoughts were interrupted when a soldier dropped a small tin beside her. White powder spilled onto the table. She flinched instantly, assuming it was medicine or some chemical. The GI chuckled, tapping the tin. "Milk," he said, miming pouring it into his cup. Milk, real milk. She hadn't seen dairy since before the war. Her curiosity overpowered her caution. She leaned in, watching the powder dissolve into the black coffee, turning it into a muddy swirl of beige and steam. For the first time, the enemy drink looked soft. She didn't know it yet, but that tin of white powder would change everything. The tin of white powder sat between them like a mystery. The Japanese nurse tilted her head, watching the American soldier pour a spoonful into his steaming cup. It hissed faintly, turned the liquid pale. Milk, he'd said the word again, slowly this time, smiling as if teaching a child. She repeated it under her breath, Maruku. The sound felt foreign, almost forbidden. When he handed her the tin, she froze. For months, everything she'd been given by authority had come with suspicion rations mixed with mold, medicine watered down, orders that meant suffering. Yet, here, in enemy hands, a stranger offered her sweetness. She tapped a little powder into her own tin cup. The granules danced, then melted into the black surface. A soldier added a second packet, sugar, white, crystalline, impossible luxury. By 1945, Japan's sugar imports had collapsed to less than 5% of pre-war levels. For her, sweetness had become mythical. She stirred the mix carefully, the spoon clinking against metal. The scent changed, less smoke, more comfort. Tentatively, she took a sip. It hit like nothing she'd ever known, hot, sweet, bitter, alive. Her eyes widened. The sweetness didn't erase the bitterness, it balanced it. It made the darkness tolerable. Around her, the soldiers grinned at her reaction, one saying, "See, not poison, ma'am." Laughter followed. For the first time, she laughed too quietly but freely. They feed us what their soldiers drink. She whispered to herself, disbelief turning into thought. That sentence echoed in her chest like a confession. Coffee, milk, sugar. Simple things, yet together they carried the taste of power. The Americans didn't just win with weapons. They won by having enough to share. The guard nodded approvingly. Better than tea, he teased. She looked down at the swirling beige liquid, then back at him. Different, she said softly. Not better, just different. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coffee through the camp again. She noticed other prisoners eyeing her cup, their faces mixing suspicion with longing. Her comrade beside her leaned close, whispering, "Don't drink too much. What if it's a trick?" The warmth in her hands suddenly felt heavier. Could kindness itself be dangerous? Tomorrow, that question would grow sharper, because not everyone was ready to trust what the enemy offered. The next day, the same dented canteen cup waited for her, filled, steaming, inviting. But this time her comrade refused to touch it. The rumor had spread fast, maybe it's poison. The nurse stared at the cup, heart-pounding. She wanted the warmth again, the sweetness, but that whisper in her ear froze her fingers. The American guard saw their hesitation. Instead of anger, he simply crossed his arms and waited. "It's coffee," he said, slower now, his tone patient. "Same as ours." To prove it, he poured a cup from the same pot, drank half in front of them, and smiled. That smile unnerved her more than any weapon. For weeks, Japanese officers had drilled them with warnings. The enemy is cunning, deceitful, merciless. Yet here he was, offering proof through sips, not bullets. Reports from Red Cross inspections later confirmed what few POW believed then: American camps provided rations nutritionally equal to U.S. enlisted diets, meat, bread, sugar, coffee, even milk when available, to people raised on scarcity. Such fairness felt impossible. Her comrade pushed the cup back toward the guard, muttering, "We are prisoners, not guests." The guard didn't argue. He just set the cup beside the nurse, nodded once, and walked away. That gesture, silent, restrained, cut through years of propaganda faster than any speech could. Her hands trembled as she lifted the cup again. The smell rose, bitter, strong, familiar now. She took a small sip. No burning, no sickness, just the same strange mix of warmth and sadness. Our own officers starved us. She whispered, "And these men offer sugar." The thought haunted her. Could it be that mercy was stronger than discipline? That perhaps the enemy's strength came from how they treated even their captives? Around her, the camp slowly shifted. Guards shared cigarettes, passed extra bread, even mended a torn sleeve. It wasn't friendship, but it was human. As dusk fell, she sat by the fire, cup empty, staring into the last swirl of brown at the bottom. Her reflection wavered there, half her, half smoke. For the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. Just a woman caught between two worlds, one fading, one rising. Tomorrow, that same warmth would return. But this time it would taste like something more than survival. Night fell cold and damp. The campfire hissed as rain hit its edges, throwing bursts of smoke into the humid Okinawa air. The nurse cupped her hands around the tin mug again, steam rising like ghosts between her fingers. She took another sip, this time without fear. It still tasted like burnt soil, like ashes and metal. But beneath that bitterness there was something else, something she couldn't name. Warmth, maybe, or peace. For a moment she just sat there, eyes closed, feeling the heat travel down her throat and into her chest. "It tastes like mud," she muttered in Japanese. The GI beside her laughed softly. "Yeah," he said, "mud that keeps you awake." She didn't understand his words, but she caught the tone, friendly, teasing. It startled her. No one had spoken to her like that since the war began. According to U.S. field manuals, coffee was brewed at 190 degrees F using steel percolators. Soldiers joked that it was hotter than hell and twice as bitter. Often they used rainwater, or worse, the dregs from canteen barrels. And yet, it was sacred. Every sunrise started with that smell. She watched them huddle in small groups, passing cups around. The coffee, crude as it was, united them. No ranks, no uniforms, just men in mud, sharing heat. She envied that ease, that casual humanity. In her world, hierarchy had always built walls. Here, warmth tore them down. When one soldier noticed her cup nearly empty, he gestured toward the pot again. "Refill," she nodded shyly. He grinned and poured. The liquid shimmered in the firelight, a ribbon of black turning gold as it caught the flame. She whispered arigato, but he didn't need translation. He smiled back, tapping his mug to hers, clink. The sound was small, almost private. Like an unspoken truce, she drank again, still bitter, still harsh. But this time it didn't repel her, it grounded her. The taste wasn't just mud, it was earth. Real, raw, alive. "It tastes like soil," she whispered, "but feels like home." The next morning, she'd find herself walking toward the fire before roll call, hoping that same smell would greet her again. And when it did, her hands would reach for the pot without hesitation. By the third morning, the ritual had formed itself, unspoken, automatic. Before the roll call, before the orders, before the long line of weary faces, there was coffee. The same dented pot, the same hiss of boiling water, the same burnt scent slicing through dawn. The nurse found herself drifting toward it every sunrise, her steps lighter now, her eyes searching for the soldier who poured without judgment. Around her, something subtle had changed. The prisoners still wore their fear like armor, but they also waited for that first sip. The small proof that warmth could exist even in captivity. Coffee had become currency. Japanese nurses traded tiny mending favors, stitching sleeves, fixing buttons, for extra packets of instant powder. The Americans noticed but didn't stop it. In a strange, silent way, the camp had begun to revolve around the bitter drink. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. military distributed over 1 billion instant coffee rations across every front of the war. Each packet promised the same thing, a few minutes of normalcy in chaos. For the prisoners, that normalcy became addictive. She didn't know the science of caffeine, but she felt it, the faint heartbeat after each cup, the alertness, the calm, the warmth that pushed the cold out of her bones. It wasn't luxury anymore, it was survival. One afternoon she caught herself humming while washing the cups. A GI overheard and smiled. "You like it now, huh?" he said, tapping his mug. She didn't answer, but her smile gave her away. Even prisoners crave what Americans crave. She later wrote in her diary, a line that would stay with her long after repatriation. It wasn't just about coffee. It was about the realization that the enemy's comforts were built not on cruelty, but on abundance. That abundance was everywhere, extra sugar cubes, spare blankets, laughter that came easily. The Americans didn't seem weighed down by victory, they were just living. And the nurse began to wonder, what kind of world ran on this kind of casual generosity? Her fingers brushed the rim of the cup, still warm, as she looked around the camp. For the first time she noticed something besides fences and guards. She noticed how clean everything was. That thought lingered, setting the stage for her next shock. The realization came quietly, through soap, not words. The nurse stood in line outside a wooden wash station, watching American medics scrub their hands before treating prisoners. One of them, barely 20, freckles under his helmet, paused, bowed his head slightly toward a Japanese woman before dressing her bandaged arm. The gesture was clumsy, unsure, but unmistakably respectful. For a second, she forgot which side of the wire she stood on. She'd seen her own officers treat subordinates like dirt. Nurses screamed at, slapped, blamed for supplies that never arrived. Discipline in the Imperial Army was built on fear, not care. Yet here, in enemy hands, respect flowed like routine. A medic handed her a bar of soap, real soap, and pointed to the basin, clean before food. He said simply. She obeyed, still stunned by the tone. Polite, not commanding. American POW hospitals, reports later revealed, averaged 1 nurse per 15 patients. A level of care unheard of in Japan's wartime medical system. Even prisoners were tended with precision. Bandages replaced daily, meals served hot, no shouting, just systems, routines, and something close to dignity. She dried her hands on a towel, heart-pounding. Was this how they treated their own soldiers too? If so, no wonder they fought differently. Maybe this, not machinery, was their secret weapon: discipline without cruelty. They called me by name, she wrote later, still astonished. Not by number. That simple act cracked something open in her. She began noticing details she'd ignored before: the GI sharing jokes as they worked, the nurses whistling softly, the cleanliness of their tents. It wasn't arrogance, it was order, and that order had made them unstoppable. As she walked back toward the barracks, she caught a reflection in a puddle. Herself, cleaner than she'd looked in months. The dirt under her nails was gone, but something else lingered, a question she couldn't shake. If this is how the enemy lives in war, what kind of peace do they build? That question followed her eyes as she looked beyond the fence, where supply trucks rumbled in the distance, engines humming, loaded with crates marked U.S. Army coffee, sugar, soap. She had no idea that those trucks carried the next lesson, one that would change how she saw power itself. The rumble came first, deep, steady, mechanical. Trucks rolled through the camp gates like an iron procession, engines coughing smoke and power. The nurse froze mid-step, eyes wide. She'd seen supply convoys before, but never like this, not endless, not effortless, canvas, covered vehicles lined up with clockwork precision, soldiers unloading crates stamped with bold black letters, coffee, sugar, chocolate, medical supplies, the air filled with diesel, sweat, and something else: certainty. This was what victory smelled like. She glanced at her comrades, their faces mirrored hers, or mixed with quiet dread. The Japanese had fought on discipline and sacrifice. The Americans fought on production and fuel. Historical records note that the Red Ball Express, the U.S. Army's supply lifeline in Europe, moved over 400,000 tons of cargo per month. In the Pacific, too, logistics won battles before bullets did. By war's end, the U.S. military owned 1 truck for every 7 soldiers. Japan, starving for resources, had barely a fraction of that. The nurse realized that even here, inside barbed wire, the same engine of abundance kept turning. There was no sign of exhaustion, no shortages, no desperation. Everything arrived on time, stacked in neat pyramids, labeled, counted. She whispered, "Their machines never rest." The words felt heavy in her mouth, a quiet surrender of understanding. That night, she sat near the fence, watching the headlights fade into darkness. She imagined the convoys stretching across oceans, across continents. Steel arteries pumping life into the war effort. America didn't win by strength alone, it won by movement, by keeping everyone fed, warm, caffeinated. And for the first time, she understood that the true weapon wasn't the rifle. It was the system that ensured the rifle always had bullets, the soldier always had coffee, and the camp always had light. The nurse took another slow sip from her cup, now lukewarm but comforting. It wasn't just coffee anymore. It was proof of a civilization that planned, produced, and persisted. As she stared into the mug, her reflection trembled with the ripples. We could never match this, she thought, and the thought didn't hurt. It humbled. But somewhere behind that humility, a question formed: when the engines stop, what will remain? The answer would come with peace and another cup. August 1946. The war was over, the empire gone, and the camp was quiet now. Too quiet. The nurse stood in a line of repatriated prisoners, her clothes cleaner, her face thinner, her heart uncertain. Ahead, a U.S. flag fluttered weakly in the Okinawa wind. Tomorrow she'd sail back to a Japan she no longer recognized. An American sergeant approached carrying a battered tin pot. Steam coiled into the grey morning. One last cup. He asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He poured carefully, steady hands despite the tremor in the air, the kind that comes when endings arrive. She lifted the mug. The smell hit her again. Bitter, burnt, grounding. The same scent from that first day, the smell that once meant fear, then survival, and now closure. She sipped. This time, she didn't flinch. Reports note that by mid-1946, over 3 million Japanese POW were repatriated from Allied camps across Asia and the Pacific. Many left healthier than when they were captured, fed, vaccinated, and oddly changed. She was one of them. The sergeant leaned on a post beside her, watching the horizon. "World's different now," he muttered. She couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone, tired, human, final. She looked at him, then down at her reflection in the dark liquid. The bitter taste no longer disgusted her. It comforted her. They conquered us without firing a shot. She thought, just kindness. Nearby, a group of women laughed softly as they received small care packages, soap, canned food, cigarettes. The nurse tucked a coffee tin into her satchel, fingers lingering on the label. It wasn't theft, it was remembrance. As she boarded the truck to the port, she turned one last time. The camp looked smaller now, the fences almost fragile. She realized she'd stopped seeing guards weeks ago, only faces. The sea wind carried the faint scent of salt and burnt beans. She smiled. The cup in her hand was empty, but it didn't feel like loss. It felt like transformation. Bitterness turned to strength. She glanced down at the black liquid stains on the rim, then at the rising sun over the bay. Somewhere ahead, peace waited. But part of her knew that the first place she'd seek home would be wherever she found that smell again. And years later, she would. Tokyo, 1958. Neon lights flickered on wet pavement, and a cold drizzle misted the city that had rebuilt itself from ashes. Inside a small cafe tucked between record shops and tailors, the nurse, now older, wearing a clean grey coat, sat alone at a counter. The radio played softly in English. The waitress set down a porcelain cup in front of her, its aroma rising warm and familiar. Instant coffee, bitter, sweet, American, she smiled faintly. For a heartbeat, the sounds around her, the chatter, the clink of cups, the hum of life blurred into a memory. Rain against canvas, a muddy camp, a foreign soldier offering her warmth instead of scorn. The steam rising from this cup was the same, only cleaner, calmer. Japan had changed, so had she. Reports show that by 1960, Japan had become the third largest coffee importer in the world. A nation that once saw coffee as enemy mud, now couldn't imagine mornings without it. Every sip in every cafe was a quiet echo of surrender turned habit, bitterness turned culture. She lifted her cup, inhaling deeply. The scent carried her back to those first uneasy mornings when she'd thought kindness was a trap and warmth a trick. It hadn't been. It had been a mirror showing her a world that fought through compassion, not just command. The waitress smiled. "Oishii desu ka?" "Is it good?" The nurse looked up, eyes soft. "Hi," she said. "It's just right." As the rain thickened outside, she opened a small tin from her purse, a faded U.S. Army coffee label, edges torn, colors long gone, a relic, nothing more, but to her it was a compass, a reminder of who she'd become. They called it mud, she whispered, tracing the letters, but it was hope all along. The neon reflected in her cup, turning the black surface gold. She sipped again, slower this time, letting the warmth fill her chest. The war was history now, but one taste had survived it all. The taste of something foreign that somehow became home. Outside, Tokyo buzzed and shimmered under the rain. Inside, a woman quietly finished her coffee, and with it a chapter of the century.